So welcome back to the show. I have a great guest today, Dan Kittredge, the Executive Director of Bionutrient Food Association. And so welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much, Eugene.
Yeah, and today, so first, before we begin, I wanted to basically say that sadly, for the most part, most people don't care about sourcing the highest quality nutrition. They just kind of look for the cheapest food available. But even for the people that do care about sourcing the highest quality nutrition, it's still like extremely difficult to navigate around the complicated landscape of food production these days. So I'm pretty sure probably in the 1700s, like everything for the most part was grown out of soil. But today, things that are, for instance, grown with hydroponics could easily be labeled organic in the US and sold at the grocery store, and you won't even know the difference. So I have an expert in the field today. First question is, we're going to cover conventional farming with a monocropping system. So can you kind of give an overview of that, Dan?
Sure. Do you care to have me share my background at all, or we can just go straight into the questions?
Yeah, definitely. You can go into your background as well.
I don't know if it matters, but my background is someone who grew up on an organic farm in Massachusetts, and whose parents, have been running an organic farming organization for the past 35 years or so. And when I, had found no other lifestyle more compelling than being a small farming homesteader, raising my children out there in the country and the land, when I got married and I had found no other more compelling lifestyle, I attempted to make a living farming, and rapidly realized that I was unable to, because basically what I've been taught about organic was insufficient to create a dynamic where my plants were healthy. And by healthy, I sort of define pest and disease resistant, for starters, which is not something that people oftentimes experience. And so this was about 15 years ago, and I started looking more deeply into the literature to understand maybe organic was better than conventional, but because it didn't use toxic chemicals, but maybe it wasn't the best. And so, started going to conferences and reading books and attending seminars, and sort of changing some of the practices that I was engaging, all still within the certified organic framework, and rapidly saw dramatic improvements in plant health, pest and disease resistance, yield, flavor, aroma, carbon sequestration, all kinds of really systemic beneficial things. And so I started giving courses and workshops, and that turned into an organization. And so the Bionutrient Food Association, we're a 10-year-old organization whose mission is to increase quality in the food supply. And by quality, we're talking about flavor, aroma, nutritive value, health-giving attribute. We think that correlates with a bunch of other exciting things, like carbon sequestration and climate, health, and other dynamics, not just better for you. So yeah, with that context, I'm happy to engage your questions. But yeah, your question was about conventional monoculture.
Yeah, I guess, like, let's say you had like a mother of two come up to you at a grocery store, and she was trying to just even understand if there's a difference between at least like the kind of conventionally farmed. And what I mean by conventionally farmed, a lot of times I give grocery store tours personally, and I give people, kind of like a background of food production. And a lot of times when I say conventionally farmed, they think that's actually organic farming, because people are so far detached from the farming lifestyle. So I'm kind of sometimes going to say factory farming, but that also indicates to crop production as well. So if like a mother of two came up to you at a supermarket and kind of like asked, can you give me the background of kind of this cheap, like factory farmed carrot, for instance, that's like very inexpensive, and should I buy it for my kids, and what are the pluses and minuses of that crop?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the important points to make in this broader conversation is that we have labels like organic or not, or just the sort of the general, not labeled, which we call conventional, which generally refers to having been produced in a fashion that included, fertilizers that are synthetic, unnatural fertilizers, oftentimes insecticides and fungicides, Generally, that correlates with mass production of one crop on large acreage, so it's quote unquote efficient. Um, and the point is that in many cases, organic crops are also grown in a very similar fashion with monocultures of one crop on large acreage, significant, tillage and degradation of the soil, fertilizers, not synthetic, but still using fertilizers, oftentimes using insecticides and fungicides, not synthetic, but still using insecticides and fungicides. And so it really gets messy fast when you try to make delineations based on label. And that's one of the foundational points that we're trying to bring forth in our work is it has much more to do with how the crop was grown than what the label is on it. And so you may have a carrot at a grocery store that is not labeled organic, that was grown by a relatively local or regional farmer at, and fairly well, and is quite nutritious and flavorful, which those things correlate. Soil health, plant health, carbon sequestration into the soil from the atmosphere, flavor, aroma, health-giving attribute. Those things are all pretty closely connected. And you might also find from your local farmer's market an organically certified carrot that was grown poorly, that is not nutritious. And so it's a very difficult question to answer. I like to say that we were foundationally engineered, designed, built, evolved, however you want to, explain it, with some pretty sophisticated nutrient monitoring devices, which are our way of seeing how good something is, and those are our noses and our tongues. And so, really, the best way to discern how good that carrot is to take a bite out of it and to see if it has that rich carroty flavor, or if it's kind of woody, or if it's bland, or if it's kind of soapy or repugnant kind of flavor. Then that would generally mean that it was grown poorly and it does not have much nutritive value for you or your child. I'm not sure I answered your question directly.
Well, can you go into the
framed it.
Yeah, can you go into the disadvantage of a monocropping system in terms of how it degrades the nutritional profile of the crop?
Sure. And even with monocrops, there's a very large variation in how things are done. So when we teach courses in our organization to farmers about how to improve plant health, one of the sort of basic points we make is that nature figured out how to do this thing of growing food really, really well. And so, one of the first things we should do is sort of look at how nature does things and see if we can mimic that. And I say, where in nature do you see monocultures? And all of one plant just growing there, nothing else growing. And nature doesn't do that. Nature does polycultures. Nature has multiple families of plants growing in proximity to each other. And there's a really important reason there, which has to do with with how the plant gets fed. So, I like to say, on none of the first 6 days did God invent fertilizer. Plants have been able to feed themselves for a very long time historically without ever being fed fertilizer, and in fact, it seems that they're healthier when they do. When they do grow that way, and the way that they have learned to feed themselves is actually a way that's very similar to humans or animals, is with a symbiotic relationship with basically their gut flora, their microbiome. So plants make sugar in their leaves through photosynthesis, and in nature they push a bunch of that sugar out of their roots into the soil to feed the microbes, the bacteria and the fungi in the soil that have the ability to digest minerals from the soil, copper and zinc and calcium and potassium, and feed them to the plant. So when the plant says, I want some copper, it injects the sugar and other compounds into the soil to feed the specific microbes who can digest copper from the soil. They eat, reproduce, go out, digest copper, die 30 minutes later, and then the plant is able to suck up their juice basically and feed itself. And it's a very symbiotic ecosystem. And if you think about you know, each plant, a carrot or a cucumber, will have its own gut flora, its own set of microbes that it lives in symbiosis with. Um, like animals, where a cow would have different gut flora than a rabbit, than a chicken, um, the more different plants you have growing in a region, in an area, the broader the spectrum of microbes and the broader the spectrum of nutrients that are available for the plants. So one of the biggest reasons why you don't want to have monocultures is because you don't have the ability to have the full spectrum of nutrients into that plant, um, which is not necessarily, an easy point to make, but I hope I conveyed it somewhat clearly. Um, so there's no way of knowing at the grocery store when you buy that bag of carrots if it was grown in a monoculture or not. There's no way of knowing, even if it's organic. A lot of the organic crops you purchase in the grocery store were grown in a monoculture environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
And on
so,
top of that, probably grown like overseas.
well, I mean, I think a lot
Well,
of the fresh fruits and vegetables are grown in North America, at least. Maybe some of the grains that are fed to the animals are grown overseas.
oh,
Yeah,
okay. I do see like a lot of organic like vegetables that are imported from Mexico, at least in Southern California. Probably half of all the
yeah. That's
vegetables.
not
So,
overseas. That's just a couple hundred miles south of the
oh
border.
yeah. Well, I meant like in another country, to be more specific.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bad wording on my part,
Sorry.
but
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
well, do you feel like monocropping kind of, I guess, opens up field to more pest problems in general versus like
Uh,
having a more like biodynamic or biodiverse farming practice?
uh, Certainly, it's those nutrients in the plant that, you know, um, when there's high levels of them, let me say, there's certain compounds in a plant that, when they're present, make it indigestible for pests and diseases. So, I like to use the example of maybe a tomato. People have had the experience of eating a tomato from the grocery store in January that perhaps was not particularly flavorful, or eating a tomato off the, out of the garden in August. If you, as an animal, know the difference in that flavor of those two tomatoes, um, in science and biochemistry, they would say that there's a massive variation in the nutrient levels in that tomato. And those compounds which correlate with flavor and aroma for us are specifically the compounds that make a plant indigestible to insects and disease. Um, in many cases, people are very familiar with, the nuances of flavor in wine or in chocolate or in beer. Um, you know, think about the notes in a glass of wine or in a chocolate or coffee, perhaps. Um, People are, have been taught to pay attention to those things. Um, that same function can be used when tasting a tomato or a carrot. Um, and so when you don't have that full spectrum of microbes in the soil, because you don't have the full spectrum of plants, then your carrot or your tomato is not able to pull up all the nutrients it needs. And so it's more likely to have a flat flavor or a lack of flavor, which will make it more susceptible to insects and disease. Yes.
And
Long
then
answer.
and then I take it the farmer then would have to use more, even the organic farmer would have to use more like pesticides or biocides of sorts, which
Yep.
will kind of degrade the soil even more and cause that cycle to kind of
Precisely.
continue, correct?
Yes, exactly. That's what happens.
What's your take on kind of like the strengths and weaknesses of the USDA Organic Program? I know there's a lot to cover in that, but kind of just your overall takeaway from that program and kind of what it does definitely assure or do well, and then what it doesn't do well.
Well, it does assure that you don't have any genetically modified, um, you know, uh, ingredients. It does ensure no synthetic fungicides, insecticides, for fertilizers, herbicides were used. There may be some residual from, if that field was had chemicals on it for 30 years and then now it's organic, you may still be having some of those chemicals on your crops, but generally much lower levels. Um, um, what else can we say? Yeah. The organic, my parents helped write some of the first organic standards in the 80s, and it was in 2000 when the U.S. government took over the term organic. And I would say that for the past 20 years now, um, the standard has been weakening. Um, Certainly, yeah, I think you can say no genetically modified material and no synthetic chemicals were applied. Um, Beyond that, it's hard to say how much you can say. Did the cows have grass all the time? There's no guarantee of that. Um, were the plants growing in soil? There's no guarantee of that. Um, it's really unfortunate that the organic standard has been weakened to the degree it has, but it certainly is. It says some things for sure.
Gotcha. Well, I know
Less toxins. You can safely say.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely tell clients on the grocery store tours is for sure you're going to decrease at least your exposure to synthetic like biocides of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. And then kind of like everything else in terms of the nutritional profile of the crop is kind of hit and miss unless you like specifically know the farming practice of where they're sourcing that crop from at the grocery store.
Even with the practice, if it's a label like biodynamic, there's some pretty large scale monoculture biodynamic farms,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean it really has to do, yeah, you have to know the farmer, I think.
Yeah.
But even then, if you aren't a farmer, how do you know how good of a job they're doing? That's what we're working on with our organization. We've said, look, what people are really looking for is nutrition in their food. It should be nutritious, and there's no way to know how good something is based on a label, because all the labels are process standards, they're not quality standards. And so what we need to do is give consumers the ability to actually check in real time how nutritious this carrot is versus that carrot. And the way you would do that is by basically flashing a light at them and reading the nutrients in the plant. The same way we can take the light from Alpha Centauri 5 light years away and we can say, look, Alpha Centauri is made up of this much hydrogen and this much helium, because each element in chemistry has a certain vibration. If we can read what something 5 light years away is made up of, we should be able to read what something a tenth of a millimeter in front of us is made up of. And so we're not too far out from having that capacity. It's a real serious issue when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. How do you know how good something is for you and your family, and how beneficial or detrimental the effect of producing it was on the environment?
Can you elaborate kind of what you guys are working on? Is that like a scan, or is that like an app?
Well,
I don't know if you're allowed to even talk about it, but just whatever you could disclose.
No, totally. We're a nonprofit educational organization, and everything we're doing is open source. It's all the data and all the engineering and everything's is on the web for free for anybody to look at. We've built a spectrometer. It's, if anybody remembers Star Trek and the tricorder, literally, you flash a light at something and it'll tell you what it's made up of. And it's it's something that we can actually produce now at a consumer price point, that can fit in your hand, that 20 or 30 years ago would have cost millions of dollars, and only the universities or whoever would have them. But now with smartphones, basically democratizing some pretty high-tech software and hardware, we have the ability to actually do this. So we've built a first generation tool that has been out for a year and a half. It's the building of the tool is actually not that big of a deal. The figuring out of what quality is a much more complicated conversation, because there is a very profound variation in nutrient levels in food, which has not been researched by anybody anywhere on the planet that we've been able to find in the literature. There is no scientific literature which says this is the least nutritious carrot possible. This is the most nutritious carrot possible. So we started by building our spectrometer in 2017, and then 2018 we built a lab, and we sent hundreds of samples of carrots and spinach. We started with just 2 crops into our lab from around the country, from grocery stores, from farmers markets, from farms, organic and not organic, and we assessed those crops for a series of different elements: copper and zinc and calcium and potassium and cobalt and molybdenum and phosphorus, and also for these compounds called polyphenols and antioxidants, which are generally considered to be very nutritious, health-giving compounds. Blueberries have high levels of antioxidants, or whatever marketing you might have heard. And so when we did this assessment in 2018, and we looked at the variation, we found 4-to-1 to 18-to-1 variation in the minerals. So, for instance, this carrot had as much copper in it as those 4 carrots, or this leaf of spinach had as much iron in it as those 18 leaves of spinach. Like, it's not 50% variation or 10% variation. It's 400% or 1800% very massive variation. And that was in the minerals. When we looked at the polyphenols and the antioxidants, those really health-giving compounds, it was between 75,000 and 200,000%. So literally, this carrot had as many antioxidants as those 75 carrots, or this leaf of spinach had as many polyphenols in it as those 200 leaves of spinach. This one leaf has the same level of nutrients in it as those 200 leaves. Oh, right. That's the variation in the supply chain that exists right now. And what we found was there was no way to predict quality based on whether something was organic or local or any other marketing. We found examples where a carrot from the grocery store that was not organic was more nutritious than a carrot that was organic from a local farmer's market, and everything in between.
Do you feel... Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Do you feel like age of the crop has a lot to do with that? Because, for instance, like, one thing I never liked about the grocery store is you never know how old the crop is when you buy it. Like, it could be already like a week or 2 weeks, like, torn from the root. And I presume like every day that it goes by, the nutritional profile kind of gets lower and lower and lower. And then you buy it, and then it sits in your refrigerator or whatever for another 2 days before you eat it. And it's like all of a sudden like 2 weeks old, like, by the time you eat it. And I presume if it's like coming from a monocrop culture, like a hardcore, like, factory farm type environment, the nutritional profile is already low. And then on top of that, the age of the crop is already kind of like high. So overall, you're kind of getting nothing at the end of the day. Is that kind of like right to say?
Well, yeah, got a couple anecdotes on that topic, but there's a couple points there. One is, what is the level of nutrients in the plant when it's harvested? And depending on how it was grown, if it got fed a lot of fertilizer, it got really big really fast. Think steroids, but it was weak. It didn't, had weak bones. So you can say that the level of polyphenols was, in the 10th percentile to begin with. And then it is true that some of these compounds do break down over time. And generally, when the plant is weaker to begin with, they break down faster. Think of an orange. If you've ever had an orange on the counter, or 2 oranges on the counter, and you left them there, one orange turned into this, green mess of mold, and the other orange dried up and turned to this little brown ball. You've seen that happen, probably. What caused one orange to rot and one orange to desiccate? And that had to do with the nutrients in the orange. When the orange has high levels of these complex compounds, it's indigestible to bacteria and fungi. Those compounds are much more stable, and it'll sit for a long time, and it'll basically dry out and not rot. Whereas if you've got an orange that had low levels of these compounds, it was digestible to bacteria and fungi, it will break down quite rapidly. So what the level of the compounds in the plant to begin with is actually a very important point. But in general, what's in the grocery store was pretty poor to begin with, and it breaks down pretty fast. Now, some things like calcium, it's in the leaf of spinach. It's not gonna not be in the leaf of spinach, but vitamin C will break down and no longer be there, only its component parts, for instance. So, yeah, we have this a group called Teak Origin, which is based out here in Massachusetts, but they're going to be launching a report, I believe, next month. And they're basically surveying the 10 biggest food store chains in Boston metro area and the LA metro area, and they're going to be publishing a report on a weekly basis of what the levels of nutrients are in the apples and the avocados and the blueberries and the tomatoes and the, et cetera, in Whole Foods, in Walmart, in Target, in, Aldi's, et cetera.
I'm
And
pretty sure those stores aren't going to be too happy about those reports.
well, I'll tell you something very interesting, which is, as I understand their data that they're about to go public with, the supply chain for Whole Foods, it takes longer than the supply chain for Walmart. So what you have on the shelf at Walmart is maybe only 5 days old, and what you have on the shelf at Whole Foods is maybe 10 days old. And so
interesting.
This is a very interesting point, because we have a stereotype that Whole Foods has higher quality, but in fact, what these guys are finding by going out and assessing crops on the shelf at these stores day in, day out, is that in many cases, the nutrient levels in the crops at Walmart are better than the nutrient levels in the crops at Whole Foods.
Interesting.
It is an absolute jumble out there.
And was that comparing by any chance like USDA certified crops at Walmart versus USDA certified crops sold at Whole Foods, or
organic certified, you mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
Both. USDA organic.
Both organic and inorganic.
Okay, interesting. And then at Whole Foods, they both consistently, both farming practices consistently came in at a lower nutritional profile because of the age of the crop, typically.
Well, I mean, we're getting into the weeds, and I hope people are following, but we can say that a lot of the way that crops are grown that show up in grocery stores is very similar, whether they have an organic certification or not. And in many cases, the organic certified carrots that are on the Whole Food shelves came from the same farm as the organic certified carrots that are on the Walmart shelves. And what happens, and they were talking, these guys I was talking to, at their company, Teak Origin, were talking about what it's like here in Massachusetts. And they said, basically, the odds that you'll have any vitamin C, I can't remember what the compound was, in your spinach on the store shelf here in Massachusetts are basically zero. By the time it gets across the country, it's all gone.
I see.
So depending on the speed of the supply chain, you will likely have more nutrients in the crop or less, whether it's, it's fewer days from harvest to when you purchase it. But when you actually do a good job growing, you start off with nutrient levels that may be, like I said, 70 times higher, and they're shelf stable. They last longer. So the real thing from my perspective is to help consumers understand where the crops are being grown well to begin with and begin to source them. And I think if we can use that as an economic lever to inspire the supply chain to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume, then we should be able to dramatically improve the nutritional value of food across the board for everybody.
When is like the most ideal time to eat, like, say, a carrot when you pick it off from the soil? I read like sometimes like 24 hours after it's been picked from the soil, it loses like half of its nutritional profile. Is that true?
I know 24 hours for a carrot is
depending,
pretty high.
Yeah.
The first question is, how much did it have to begin with? And a carrot that was grown well will have 75 times more to begin with than a carrot that was grown poorly. So a half of the poor quality carrot, a half left, is almost nothing. The high quality carrot, half left, is still a whole bunch. But that it's a really important that we understand what I said about the oranges,
Hmm.
that not all carrots are the same, and the speed of degradation varies dramatically based on how the plant was grown to begin with. So when you start with crops that were grown well, they have a much longer shelf life, which correlates to much longer nutritional value.
Yeah. Well,
We
let's say
can't we
just,
can't we can't
yeah,
establish like a simple binary on any of these things,
I see.
monocultures or organics or time or genetics. They're all interrelated, and that's the complicated piece of this whole conversation. There's no simple. I mean, unless you're looking at the nutrient levels, the actual nutrient levels in the food, there's not a really easy way to have a hack.
I see. So just asked a different way. Let's say you have um, two of the same carrots produced exactly the same way, and they do have
Mm-hmm.
that high nutritional profile you mentioned.
Yeah,
And they're both picked, just like one that's 5 days old would obviously have a lower nutritional profile than one that's like you eat within 24 hours. Is that safe to say that?
um, it is safe to say that, but the question is how much lower.
Yeah, that's obviously extremely variable. But my
And I would
point was
say,
that like
yeah,
the longer the time frame of the crop being picked, obviously the lower the
sure,
nutrient quality in
yep,
the crop. So
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yep.
Well, how about, I know, I don't know exactly when this has been done, but I know, at least from my research, like the US is the only country that allows like hydroponics to be certified as USDA organic and sold as organic.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of go over that production practice? And obviously they don't even use soil in that production practice, and how that kind of relates to the nutritional profile of the crop.
Um, yeah, well, um, I just have to say that a lot of the crops that are quote unquote grown in soil don't have much life in the soil, and they're functionally not much different than hydroponic. So
Mm.
you take, the Florida tomatoes, for example, and Florida is a big sand dune, and they till like crazy, and it's pretty dry, and they have an irrigation line that they put down that runs right down the line of the tomato plants, and there's a bunch of soluble nutrients that go through that irrigation line that the tomato plant uses to build its body with. And
Mm.
so that soil is not alive. It's really pretty much inert. It's dead. It's a material to hold the plants up in. It's dirt. It's not soil. And that is not much different than a hydroponic system. A hydroponic system might use um, you know, cocoa coir or rice hulls or um, perlite, some sort of stable mass to hold the roots up. And then they have an irrigation line that comes through and puts nutrients in the water into that root zone, and then the plant sucks them up. I like to use the example of an IV drip. I
Mm-hmm.
say, if you're in a car accident and you're in a coma and you're in the hospital for 3 days or a week, they will take soluble nutrients and inject them directly into your bloodstream, and you can be kept alive. And great, I'd rather be alive than dead. But um, that's not how you evolve to eat. You evolve to eat through a symbiotic relationship with your gut flora from foods that were very sophisticated biochemically and complex and had all kinds of nuances in them. And you've got a feedback loop depending on what the balances of nutrients are in your body, where you're saying, I want carrots today, or I want cheese tomorrow, or whatever, because your body is asking for different things. And there's a really nuanced and sophisticated feedback loop that we've evolved with, which is functionally how plants have evolved to grow in relationship to soil. And so the hydroponic system is like that IV drip. It is soluble nutrients that basically get injected into the root zone and are sucked up in their form by the plant roots. It can't really control it because they're soluble. If it's taking in the water into the roots, it's taking nutrients into the roots. And so it's basically an industrial it's like a factory system. You create these little pots and you put the plants in them and you just dial in the right soluble nutrients and the plants grow because they can't help it. But they have nowhere near the subtlety and the nuance and the complexity of plants that are growing in soil would. So, yeah, it happens to be economically advantageous for some growers to produce some crops that way. And so there's been a move on to allow that as organic certified. And even though the original organic certification standards make reference to improving the quality of the soil that the plants grow in, back in the 80s and the 70s, when these rules are being written, no one even contemplated that somebody who was trying to do a better job with growing food would consider this industrial mindset. But that's where we're at with organic. It's been taken over by industry. And so there's, certain organizations that are certifying agencies that have gotten paid lots of money to certify these operations. And it's one of those things where money talks. In Europe, they don't allow it. Absolutely. And they won't allow anything that's organic to be sent over there anymore because they don't trust us. So,
How's like a vegetable in a hydroponics operation able to kind of like grow to full size without basically having all of that stuff you mentioned? I always wondered that part. Like, how could they bypass like so many things, and it still kind of grows and looks like very healthy on the surface and is very crunchy and crisp when you pick it up at the supermarket?
Well, I mean, there is no one hydroponic system. Let's just be clear. There's all kinds of dynamics of flooding systems or pots or aeroponics where things are sprayed into the roots. The manner by which plants have evolved to get nutrients into their bodies, as I said before, was through a symbiotic relationship with the microbes. And what we're looking for as a standard for it's good for you is that flavor which correlates with those nutrient levels. So it's possible to get, but by balancing the potassium and the calcium and the phosphorus levels, etc., you can get a certain level of crispness. You can get a certain level of speed of growth. You can kind of force it. Think about growth hormones. Think about steroids, right? If you inject somebody with steroids, you can get them to grow rapidly. They will appear to have big muscles, but we understand that there's all kinds of other systemic issues that your body experiences by, overemphasizing the growth of those muscles. That's basically what happens in a hydroponic system or any fertilizer system, is that you're effectively emphasizing the growth of the volume and the aesthetic of the crop, and not supporting life in building it more completely. We have the surface aesthetic as opposed to the nutrition of the flesh, and that's where I think that's where the misunderstanding has been, the lack of understanding. If it looks good on the surface, it must be good.
Well, I mean, from the supermarket's perspective, like people rarely buy like the ones that look kind of weird or that are like a little bit smushy. They usually just go kind of like right for the basically tomato that you can kind of bounce off the ground for the most part.
Which was picked green, and so all the nutrients that were supposed to get put into it in the ripening process never were. And so even though it looks like a nice tomato, when you bite into it, you as an animal know it's no good for you. And that's the piece that no one's talking about, is that the surface, the facade may be pretty, but the actual substance is not there, the nutritional substance.
Yeah, and I think these like food giants, obviously their big advantage is that, like 9.9 out of 10 citizens, especially in the US, are like so far detached from the farming lifestyle. They don't know kind of like one from the other. It kind of like basically all looks the same a lot of times on the surface. And they're very busy, obviously, with their work, and maybe a decent amount of them are doing as well, so they can't pay like the super high premium price or whatever. Sometimes that's
Mm-hmm.
required. And so yeah, I feel
Or
basically people are,
no time for cooking in the first place,
yeah, even
right?
exactly,
Yeah.
no time for cooking. Yeah. Well, what's your take about like biodynamic systems?
Biodynamics is a suite of practices that was propounded by a guy named Rudolf Steiner in the 1920s. He was a clairvoyant, a mystic, um, um, and um, certainly I think he had a number of valuable insights to offer. Um, but that does not mean that what he offered is what the certification label requires.
Oh, you mean the
Um,
Demeter certification? Is that what you're referring
precisely.
to? Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
There's a big difference between the intention of what organic used to mean, or like where it started out, and what the label means now. And similarly with biodynamics, there's a big difference between what the intention was of how it started and what the label means now. It's, I would say, similar to organic, perhaps on average a little bit better, but um, the subtle aspects of biodynamics that are the core insight that Steiner put forth, I don't think that they're much involved in the biodynamic certification. I mean, I don't think you have to be having closed the loop. There's plenty of monoculture, tillage, fertilizer, biodynamic cropping systems, um, and that's for sure.
Hmm.
So
I didn't know they would allow monocropping in a biodynamic system. Don't those two words not work together?
you may have your hopes about what these labels mean, but on the ground, if somebody's growing, wheat, biodynamic wheat for Cheerios or regenerative Cheerios or whatever, um, that wheat was not grown in the field that had anything else growing in it. That was 2,000 acres of just wheat, nothing else. And it was tilled in the spring, and it was given fertilizer of a sort that's approved by biodynamic practices.
I see. And then
Any grain you get, pretty much guaranteed, it was grown in a monoculture. Soy, oats, wheat, beans, peas, sunflower seeds, canola. I mean, organic or not, biodynamic or not, it's just about 100% guaranteed it was grown in a monoculture.
I see. I see. Well,
There are
let's.
not many crops there's not much food out there that's not grown in a monoculture, really. Your tomato plants, you grow 5 acres of tomatoes or 50 acres of tomatoes, it's just tomatoes, that's a monoculture.
Yeah. Well, what's your take about like permaculture? I know it's like, at least from my understanding, like overlapping quite a bit with biodynamic, but do you have any input on that farming practice?
Permaculture, I think is an attempt to turn back to what the indigenous cultures were doing quite successfully for tens of thousands of years in managing the land. It is predicated much more on that polyculture understanding. Most permaculture operations are not producing crops on scale, not because it can't be done, but because that's not their mentality. When you're a permaculturalist, you don't really want to be doing a massive business. You're actually looking more to a quality of life and a relationship to the nature around you. So I would say that organic has a certain number of relevant insights. Biodynamics has definitely some relevant insights, and permaculture also some relevant insights. I think they all could benefit from learning from each other, and they each have pieces of value and maybe some blind spots if we're talking about how to best design or run the food supply. They're more interested in perennial crops, for instance, the permaculture community. They want you to be eating, hardy kiwis and hazelnuts. They kind of look down on tomatoes and and wheat and carrots. They're much more into perennializing, looking at these crops which are not sort of been bred for mass production. They generally have much higher nutrient levels in them. They require much less effort, less machinery, less tillage, less fertilizer, etc. But the consumers aren't usually looking for those kinds of foods.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's your take, like, if the consumer is like, okay, I mean, for the most part, like supermarket, even organic crops kind of suck, and I want to go to a local small farmer, but obviously there are various levels of integrity of
Yeah.
farming, as you've mentioned as well. Like, what are some checks a person can look for in kind of like a small farm operation to see that it is an operation that's producing like a high profile nutrition in the crop?
I think the best thing to do is to actually check the nutrient levels, and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, there are some decently large, quote unquote, conventional farms that are producing pretty high quality nutritional food. So I'm not saying it can't be done. But yeah, I mean, the simplest tool we have now, the best tool is always your tongue. But you actually have to pay attention. You have to actually taste the carrot or taste the kale.
Mm-hmm.
If you want an empirical tool, the best thing we have available is something called a refractometer, which was developed in the early 1800s. It's a very, very simple tool. It's basically you take a piece of the carrot or a piece of tomato or a piece of whatever it is, and you squish it, and you get the juice that comes out, and you put that on like a little slide, and you look through it, and you get a number. And basically, the higher the number, the better, and that'll correlate with flavor, correlate with shelf life.
Mm.
It is an invasive process. You do need to destroy a piece of the crop to get the reading, but it will give you an actual number, an empirical number, and that generally correlates very nicely with quality. We're hoping that our spectrometer, we're going to have calibrations for our first 4 crops, I would guess between March and April of this year.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This is a hole in the broader food conversation that doesn't seem to have been filled yet, which is, can we, the people, actually see how good our food is?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's milk or meat or vegetables or grains. I'm not going to be judgmental about what you should or shouldn't eat. There are certainly, some milk is categorically bad for you. The 4-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, omega-6 is American Heart Association says bad for you. But
Mm-hmm.
then if a cow is actually eating grass, actually not just grass, but a full spectrum of plants from her pasture,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
her milk can have that 1-to-1 omega-3, omega-6 ratio and actually have a number of wonderful health-giving attributes. You can assess that with the kind of technology we're building. You can assess that with a refractometer.
And you said that's going to be out like in April or May?
The tool is available now. You can buy it.
Oh, okay.
The question is, what does the tool tell you? And so I started saying
That's
earlier,
right. Yeah.
we built the tool first, and then we didn't have any calibration to give you a response to. And so we're working on that now. And, the third leg of that stool is actually correlating management practices with quality results, because we don't want farmers to be in a situation where their buyers say, look, your stuff is no good, we don't want it. We want to be able to have a framework where we can say to farmers, based on these environmental conditions, it looks like these are the practices you should change to get better nutritional results. So we have this Real Food campaign where we're working on those 3 legs of the stool, building a tool that can work for a consumer, figuring out the variation in nutrient levels, correlating it to management so we can support growers in changing their practices. And one of the interesting corollaries in this whole process is that actually when a plant is growing well, it's making sugar through photosynthesis out of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil to feed soil life. You're functionally taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. And we've got lots of farms that are operating in large scale in monocultures, but actually managing for life, where they're sequestering carbon at a rapid rate. Rapid rate. So, we look at the numbers of CO2 in the atmosphere. It was 280 in 1750, and it's 410 or 415 now. We have the ability through farming done well to bring CO2 levels down to where they were in 1750 in maybe 10 years. I mean, we can literally pull all the carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil and stick it there where it came from, most of it, in 10 years if we did farming differently. So I like to make the point, this is not just about your health and your children's health. It's about the climate and the environment. Farming is either, toxic for the environment or beneficial to the environment, depending on how it's done. And how it's done connects directly to how it tastes and how good it is for you. So anyway, that's just a little point.
Where would people be able to find that device that you guys made?
Bionutrient.org is our website. Bionutrient, one word. We created it out of thin air. We're calling it the Bionutrient Meter. It is a first generation tool. It's not slick. It's not fancy. There will be a much fancier one out in a couple of years. They'll be mass produced and work better. But it's a process. We're an educational organization. We're a nonprofit. We're doing everything on donations. We're not a for-profit corporation trying to lock up the IP and control the data flow. We think this all should be done for the greater good. And there's nobody out there trying to put it all together. So, yeah, barring competition, we might pull it off. Yeah.
Cool. So I take it, since you guys, you're not selling it on Amazon or any of those sites, just on that site in particular.
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah, and it, like I said, it is a first generation tool. It's wonky, it's clunky, it works, but it's not slick, and that's just where we're at in the development process right now. If you had bought an Apple One in 1976 and you weren't somewhat technologically sophisticated, you probably couldn't have figured out how to work it. If you waited for the Apple II, all of a sudden this was this amazing, interface. So that's where we're at right now, between the Apple One and the Apple II.
I see.
As far as engineering is concerned.
Well, before we close up, I wanted to cover kind of like more of a little bit of a political issue in your landscape. Do you feel kind of like small farms are decreasing like more and more still, and kind of factory farms are just kind of taking over? I know they probably own the market overall quite a bit, but do you feel it's kind of still going in that direction, or do you feel it's like reversing a little bit now, since at least people are becoming, although they're still like very sick and ill for the most part, most people, they're still becoming like a little bit more health conscious and realizing that, just taking medication isn't going to make you healthy long term or even short term a lot of times. So
yeah. Well, where the consumers are at and what the farmers are doing, it's an ebb and flow. I mean, I think there was a really strong local food movement, by 10 years ago. The federal government was putting a lot of money into it, and it was very hip. And then some of the retailers started to realize that they were losing the market share. And then now people, who were going to farmers markets and getting their local CSA shares are getting, their vegetables delivered to them via an app delivered to their house. So that's taken the market share away from the farmers and put it back into the small farmers and put it back into the big suppliers. It's an ebb and flow, and it's definitely a little bit of extra work to source well from farmers who are doing a better job. And as long as people have this concept that all food is the same, they don't really have a reason to do that. When you realize that this carrot is 18 times more nutritious than that carrot, and the reason your children don't like carrots is because they're animals and they can tell that it's not good with their tongues, and you want your kids to eat their carrots and you have to get them carrots that taste good, then you have to go out and source them. I think when we begin to understand the connection between nutrient variation in food and flavor and health-giving attribute, I think there's going to be a much stronger demand from consumers for that. I mean, realistically, in Southern California, you're in LA. I mean, you got way too many people, not enough land to have small farmers supporting your population. You've got this amazing, valley, Central Valley, where a lot of food is grown, but it's done in a very, very toxic fashion. there's no reason why the farmers in the Central Valley couldn't change their practices. But the only question is what will cause them to. And I think it's the consumers saying, look, we don't want the stuff that's empty, it doesn't have any flavor, and is not really healing us. We want the stuff that is more nutritious. I think when the consumers can say we can discern between good and bad, right? We can read right past the label and the marketing to see what the inherent value of that food is, and we're choosing accordingly. I think that's when the supply chain is going to get the message. I'd like to say that everybody should be getting food from small farmers. I'd like to say that a lot of people should be living in the country that are living in the city right now. And that's not really my place to say, I don't think. But I think we can systemically improve the quality of the supply chain, the quality of nutrition.
Yeah, I think that conscious awareness of health is going to be a tough milestone because, like, for instance, like a lot of times when I give grocery store tours, a lot of people come up to me and they'll be like, man, I've been eating this like factory farm food my whole entire life and I'm completely fine. But meanwhile, the guy's like obese, on 3 different medications, has all sorts of joint pain. And like what that tells me is kind of like a lot of people have lost the conscious awareness of what health even is, because the people next to them at work at their office might even be like more unhealthy, you know? Yeah. But all of them are kind of like, for the most part, unhealthy. I mean, it's kind of like depressing to say, but I would say like it's pretty accurate too. Like pretty much anywhere you step out, like outside in America, probably 9 out of 10 people you run into are like full of like obesity and disease, like full of like mental and physical pain.
I would say the way I explain is that the only reason you have to go to a doctor is because you're sick. If you aren't sick, you shouldn't have to go to a doctor. Personally, I haven't been to a doctor in more than 20 years, and I've got no reason to. I don't have a doctor. I don't go to a doctor. I don't need to go to a doctor because I'm not sick. If you go to doctors and get, diagnosed with ailments and then get recommended, medicines, that means you're sick. And just to emphasize your point, sickness, dis-ease has been normalized in our culture.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I feel like, for instance, like to reinforce your point a little bit more, like if a little kid will understand how to solve this problem, but a grown educated adult has like, it seems like no clue, at least to me. And that's like if a kid has like a rock inside his shoe, he simply takes the shoe off, takes the rock out, and then puts the shoe back on and continues to walk pain-free. But an educated adult, like under the American system of healthcare, will just take painkillers and continue to walk with that pain in their foot.
Because in many cases, they're not being provided with a understanding of an alternate path.
Yeah, and like the importance of getting to like the etiology of the problem, instead of just constantly throwing more medication at it or some silly diets or whatever.
Solving the cause, not the symptom, right? Addressing the cause of the symptom. But the medical profession is not trained in nutrition. So, alternative health practitioners are not covered by insurance. I mean, the system is basically designed to facilitate, energy and money and attention going towards that allopathic system.
One thing I never understood about the universal healthcare system is it's like so expensive. And I think if like the government just took like a small fraction of that amount of money and just reinvested into basically kind of like, lack of a better phrase, but brainwashing kids from like elementary school through high school just how to eat properly and move properly and have good communication skills and know their core values, like that would solve the whole entire health epidemic.
We wouldn't have the cost, right? I mean, the cost of universal healthcare would be much lower.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be like a small fraction of what that universal healthcare plan would cost. And on top of that, like, dude, you're never going to become healthy just taking pills and going to the doctor's office. It's just not going to work, no matter how much you want to believe into
the way it works right now is the government subsidizes the form of agriculture which produces junk, not food, and then they subsidize the research into pharmaceuticals that cover up the symptoms. I mean, if the government stopped subsidizing the food supply production and it stopped subsidizing the pharmaceutical production, we would have a much more of a capitalist system, right? What we have right now is more fascist, where
Hmm.
the industry is directing the use of government money for its own purposes. And that is not a free market. That is not, um, capitalism. So I think, yeah, it, there's some very simple things that could be done, but the question is, where's the money, and who's got control of those levers? And so that's where our strategy of, um, you know, the agribusiness will keep having money as long as you keep giving it money. So let's create a dynamic where you can choose food that was not produced by agribusiness. You can actually suss it out by its nutritional value. If we start putting our money towards food that's nutritious, that's going to automatically mean less money for agribusiness, right? I mean, we have to take our power. I don't think, I mean, whatever, there's a role for government and all that, but if we don't take responsibility for our own lives, I don't know if we can honorably blame someone else, or pass responsibility off to someone else. I think we really need to take ownership for ourselves in these decisions. We do have the power. We have our vote with our dollar. If we start buying food that's nutritious, that's trillions of dollars a year that start being spent in a different way. Well, industry is going to pay attention and change their actions. We have the power. We just need to
Yeah.
use it, and we need to
Yeah.
focus it towards solutions. And I think, you know, nutrition, flavor, aroma, soil health, these things are all lined up beautifully with our health and our vitality and our children's health. Um, this is where we can prevent a lot of those dysfunctions in our body, is by, eating food, not junk.
Hmm. Yeah. Well,
Anyway,
do you have any closing statements that you want to throw in before we call it a day?
I think it's been a pretty good conversation.
Cool. Well,
Um,
thanks for
yeah,
being a guest on the show. I will include a link to your website and other links you give me like after the show in the description section. So for any
beautiful.
audience members that want to get a hold of Dan, you can just click on those, and I'm sure he'll hopefully reply to you.
Bionutrient.org and realfoodcampaign.org are our two URLs. Yeah.
Cool. All
Beautiful.
right. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks, Eugene. Yep.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this podcast. If sourcing high quality food is something you're interested in, but definitely find the subject matter confusing, check out my book on Amazon titled Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide. It's a very easy and non-technical read that's beautifully illustrated and comes with a comprehensive video series and other extended learning material. The book, in a very simplified way, breaks down the difference between caged, cage-free, free-range, and pasture-raised meats. It'll cover how to avoid GMOs, source high-quality water, fish, supplements, and many other related topics. Thanks again for checking out the podcast, and when you have a second, please check out Anti-Factory Farm Shopping Guide by Evgeny Trufkin on Amazon.